Well, hello everybody again. This is Lance Miner with NextLearn. I'd like to welcome you all to the monthly webinar series. This month we have Dr. Clark Quinn with us. If I could have everybody online, just kind of use your control panel and give me a show of hands to make sure everybody can hear me. Excellent. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. All right, so that means we are projecting, we're broadcasting. Dr. Quinn, are you with us?
I am here.
Excellent. All right. Well, I'd like to go ahead and share my screen real quick. And what you have here is our flyer for this 2014 Immersive Learning University Conference. Our guest today, Dr. Clark Quinn, is actually going to be one of our keynote speakers, the keynote speaker. And today's webinar is actually the second in a two-part series that we're doing leading up to his keynote speech. So we really appreciate having you online, Dr. Quinn. And for those of you who are also joining us, I wanted to let everybody know that we're going to be sending out a discount code to allow you to get a discount off on the price for the Immersive Learning University Conference this year that's going in Charleston. And so by participating, we're going to send out that code. You can get it. And we really invite everybody to come out. It's been the last 2 years have really been exciting, and we're growing, and we've got quite a few great things planned to include 2 days of workshops. We've got some SimWriter Basic and SimWriter Pro training going on. All of the, or many of our designers, and not only graphic designers, but excuse me, I got a technical thing here. We've got quite a few of our instructional designers as well as our graphic designers are going to be there, and we're going to be able to, you can rub elbows and trade stories with a lot of experts in the e-learning field. So we really invite everybody to come on out. So what I'd like to do right now is turn over the controls to Dr. Quinn, to Clark, give you the con, sir. I'm going to make you the presenter, and you can show your screen. Change presenter here to Dr. Quinn. Yes. All right.
Go. Let's go. And thank you all for joining me today. And sorry for subjecting you to my face, except for the fact that two things. Usually it's just because I don't know about you, but I always find it easier to listen to somebody when I've seen their face. Somehow it makes it easier. And the second thing is, if you saw the picture on the flyer, you'll note that that's the old official photo, and I've had an outbreak of fur on my face, and look a wee bit different these days. So let's get into it. I greatly appreciate you being here. Too often, in what we do for learning, we have people practice until they get it right. Now, that's not a bad thing if they just need a taste of it. But for most situations, most opportunities where we're trying to help people be able to achieve what our organization needs them to be able to achieve, they need to be able to execute reliably and repeatably. We need to get people to practice until they can't get it wrong. That's what the pros do. You look at that, they practice so that they can't make mistakes. And they might still make some, but they're going to be a lot less. And this is what we see in places where, people's lives are on the line, like flying planes and conducting surgery. These people are practicing so they can't make mistakes. And yet, when we have business activities on the line, money at stake, we should really be thinking a lot about how do we make our practice deeper and more meaningful. And that's what I want to talk about today. I will encourage you, by the way, to use the question feature to pose any questions you have. And Lance is going to be kind enough to interject if necessary, but I'm going to try and stop and be able to address any questions you have that arise, and I appreciate that. A little bit about my background so you know the strange and twisted way I look at the world and can understand what I say in light of that. I saw the connection between computers and learning as an undergraduate and ended up designing my own major in that, and went out and designed educational computer games for a couple of years and went back to graduate school in what was effectively applied cognitive science, trying to understand how do we design systems for the way people really learn, not perhaps some of our folk understandings of how learning happens. And I apply that knowledge to the design of solutions to meet organizational performance needs. And so that connection, and across the years, I've had the chance to use a lot of different technology. I've worked with, I was just reciting the other day, mainframes, mini computers, microcomputers, handhelds, adaptive systems, web. And so it's that integration of deep understanding of cognition with a really broad experience with technology that I try to bring to bear for people. And that's the background that colors what I think. Now, enough about me. How about you? And so, Lance, if we can get the poll up here and allow people to answer this, I'd love to know about you. You know, who here is maybe a trainer? Who here is perhaps an instructional designer? Who here is instead considers himself more a developer? Who here is a manager? And others, you know, put those. We don't have a chat, but we have as I understand it, but we have a questions place where you can indicate any things I've really missed. Oh, and I can see the poll. You'll be happy to know. So I can see that half of you voted, and that a lot of instructional designers here, and some managers, and I hope that indeed we have more than 100% totals, which means you are able to answer all that apply. But a good proportion of developers and trainers as well. And thank you for that. It just helps me to understand, you know, the background that I'm speaking to. And so, again, welcome. I want to suggest that, you know, not controversial at all, it's not about learning. And here we're talking about the immersive learning event, and yet it's not about learning, because we don't learn for learning's sake. We learn to be able to do things we can't do now. And sometimes learning isn't the best solution. What I have talked about is starting instead with backwards design. And on the right-hand side of the diagram, you'll see the performance vision. What would it look like if this person were performing optimally? And it may not be that everything has to be in their head. It may not be that they have to solve it in their head. They may be using tools. They may be using interactive tools. If it's a customer service rep, do they have a troubleshooting guide to help the customers? If it's a salesperson, do they have sales tools available? What would be the optimal balance or mix between what the performer knows and what the performance environment provides? And then you go backwards from there to the left to say what has to be in the head and what can be in the world. And then you design what's in the world first, because you want to build the performance resources, whatever they are, and then you want to design the learning experience to incorporate those. So it's a slightly different spin on thinking about how do we do our analysis so that we can do our solution design, and then we try and put as much in the world as we can, and then we put as little. And the reason I suggest put as little in the head as possible is because our heads are really bad at remembering rote information and complicated procedures. We're really good at pattern matching and problem solving, and we should be providing the models that we can do that. And we should be putting rote information and well-known procedural steps in the world to support people. And
hey, Clark.
Yeah. Sorry,
hey, Clark, this is Lance. Hey, when you're looking at this design, the diagram here, where's the problem? Where's the place that most people kind of fail in understanding, you know, this shift, this kind of paradigm shift you're talking about, where we're in focusing on the world first before what we really want to know, or what we need them to know? Where do people see the disconnect most often in your experience?
In my experience, people have courses as their only hammer, and then the rest of the world looks like a nail. Everything needs a course. So they ignore basically the whole bottom half of the diagram here. that they just think, well, I have to get it in the head, and they'll try and train people to remember huge amounts of product data, and they'll try and get people to remember very complicated procedures and troubleshooting processes, and it's just very hard to do, and we don't spend enough effort, and then we get frustrated and go, why aren't they performing better? Because we're not matching what we do to how our brains work very well. And so that whole notion of performance support is beginning to again be recognized. But and then the second thing is really learning experience design. We don't think about designing learning experiences, we design learning events, and there's important nuances that differentiate there. But thank you. Good. Appreciate the question.
Sure.
Now, I have been trying in a number of different ways to try and make it difficult to think of learning as a knowledge dump and knowledge test experience, because there's a lot of evidence that you may get it into their heads, but it doesn't going to lead to any change in behavior. It's not going to get them doing things differently. And what does get people doing things differently is doing things differently before in practice that you want them to be doing in the real world. And so what I'm showing here is a way to try and rethink what learning is, where the curricula is not about content. The curricula is a series of activities that develop these abilities, and they start simpler and they get more complex. There's a trajectory there, but moving from left to right, they're going through a series of activities that develop the capability. That's the curriculum, and that drives you to the content. Now the content is meaningful because I know why I need it. Oh, I'm trying to do this activity, and I don't know how. Now I want to go look at the resources. As an outcome of the activity, we produce products and rationales behind that is great feedback for mentors and performance supporters to go in and look and say, are they really getting it? Has this activity led to the understanding we need, or do we need to go design some other activities? And when people have to show their thinking, it really provides the evidence you need to be able to determine whether they're doing well. And you have the basis for providing feedback to them too. And it naturally brings in the 21st century skills of communication and design and creativity if you're designing them right. And that's where you use tools is to support people doing the activities and creating the products and the reflections. So I realize this is a bit conceptual, but what I'm trying to do is provide a broader picture about what makes effective learning so we can drill in and then start focusing on what makes effective practice. So I hope you're with me so far.
I got one thing to ask.
Sure.
When I was talking to a client recently, and he showed me a product that they had put together, and it kind of brought to mind brought up the term, the comparison between demonstration versus participation or activity. And I look at your diagram there, and the idea between you've got the curricula and the resources, and then you have activity and you have content. And if you think of someone doing something, participating and showing or demonstrating an action, was that more of an activity, or does that fall in the realm of just presenting content? And I mean, it's kind of a subjective question depending on what you're watching, I suppose. But the difference between as a demonstration where your user is not actually doing it himself or herself, they're watching it being done. Does that fall in the realm of activity or content?
It falls in the realm of content. So you're consuming, essentially you're playing a static role. You're either reading or you're observing. That is content that serves as a reflection opportunity on your activity. People always, I love when people complain, we say you can't do knowledge dump and knowledge test, and yet we go to conferences. Well, there's a reason that makes sense. That's the people who go to conferences are deeply engaged in this activity, and then they go to hear somebody else who's talking about that activity in different ways, and those serves as reflection opportunities. Learning is action and reflection. So there's a role for those demonstrations. They're examples, but that is still content that they will then should apply. Then they should take a chance to, now you've showed me how to do it, let me try myself. So that coupling is what I'm talking about.
Excellent. Thanks.
No worries. One other point I want to make, particularly in line with my opening about practice so you can't get it wrong, Dr. Will Thalheimer, one of our great practitioners of looking at research and interpreting that in terms of what we should be doing, has a lovely paper called Spacing Learning Over Time. And in fact, he will be at the Immersive Learning University event in January as well. And he's a colleague and a friend. And he produced this diagram about spaced learning. And that normal learning curve you see in the middle going up, that practice, actually leads to slightly better performance on the test. So when we do this masked event-based learning, boom, 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 we actually do better on the test right afterwards. But look at what happens to it as time goes beyond that learning event. It drops away amazingly rapidly. And this is your college experience. Remember, you crammed the night before the test, you did okay on the test. 3 days later, you couldn't remember a thing of what it was and doing it right. But that space learning curve, if you space out learning, you may not do quite as good right there on the test, but it's around later when you need it. And if you reactivate that over time, give them another little practice or give them another little example or spaced out over time, it's there when we need it. And I want to suggest that if we're not trying to make sure it's there when it's needed, why are we bothering? So let me drill into what I think of as really important, meaningful activity. I want to suggest that most of what is going to benefit organizations is not the ability to recite information. It's going to be the ability to make decisions that we're not making at all now or not making well. We want people to make the right decisions at the right time. That's what people should be good at, is assessing a situation and making a decision and taking an action. That's what we want people doing. And the best way to get people to do it is to give them practice in doing that. Now, this is a framework I'm going to return to several times during the course of this session, so I want to elaborate on it a little bit. Typically, when you face decisions, there's a setting in which it is set in, and that setting helps contextualize performance, and it turns out we're better off learning when it's contextualized. There's a right answer in the setting. There's typically a right answer and consequence of that, and then there's also wrong answers, and we're going to go deeper into what makes a good wrong answer. And there's consequence to that. Now, that by itself is just a better multiple choice question. But in the real world, the consequences of your answers tend to lead to new situations and new decisions. They tend to travel in packs. So creating environments in which learners are making decisions and dealing with the consequences and making subsequent decisions that reflect the types of activities they have to perform in the real world is a really powerful learning experience. And that's the performance. And the closer we make the performance experience look like the practice experience look like the performance experience, the better, higher likelihood we have that the outcome is going to be correct. And learning is a probabilistic game. It really is. So we need to do everything we can to increase the probability that the learning that we want occurs. So are you with me so far?
I am. What the probabilistic game? Explain that a little bit more.
You can lead a learner to learning, but you can't make them think, to paraphrase Dorothy Parker.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so people are...
So you're playing the probabilities of whether our success as instructors and teachers hinges on the probability that only a portion of them are going to think.
Well, that the way we present it is going to resonate with these learners. And there's a number of things we can do to increase the probability, and I'm going to be going through those. But if you just sort of present one demo, maybe some 5% of the people that might work for them, but it's highly unlikely. Now, if we present a demo and give a practice, boom, the likelihood goes up higher. Gotcha. If we give a conceptual model and several examples and several practices, now we're beginning to get a much higher likelihood that everybody is going to, that a percentage of the audience is going to actually be able to acquire this and perform as we're desired. So it's,
okay.
But there's a number of things we do that don't really make a delta on that probability, and yet we continue to do this.
We spend a lot of time on those. We can present decisions, but if the decisions are blatantly obvious, then we're not going to get genuinely wrong answers that are based in plausible choices that they would make, and in the meantime, the level of learning is reduced.
Yep. If we think that a lot of knowledge dump and is going to lead to a change in performance, that actually has a very low probability.
Gotcha. All right.
Small editorial comments coming through for me. I've been doing this for 30 years. I'm a wee bit opinionated. All right. Thanks for that. There's one other element I want to address, speaking of probabilities. Too often we focus purely on the cognitive, and that is, what is the knowledge and the behavior and the skills, and we forget about the emotional side. And if the emotional side plays a role in increasing the probability of the learning happening. So, for instance, how many of you learn best when you're really unmotivated? I'm not expecting to see any hands here. And how many of you learn best when you're really, really anxious? And it turns out a little bit of anxiety helps. There's a U-shaped curve, but it tends to be somewhat different for different people. So some people who are really sort of uncertain learners can't deal with a lot of anxiety, and other overconfident learners can deal with a lot of anxiety. And it may help them to fail to knock down their confidence a bit. But what we might think of, and this is a purely hypothetical graph, but think about right before we start, we'd like to get their motivation up before they even start learning anything, just helping them, and I like to start with a motivating example, that gets them helps them understand, oh yeah, I do need this. And we want to reduce anxiety right away. So they might understand now that they need this, but they may also be scared. And so we need, in introducing and setting the stage for people, we need to help reduce that anxiety to a level where it's appropriate for learning. And we gradually want to build their confidence until, at the end, they don't need motivation because they're confident. They know they can do it now. And so they don't need to motivate the learning. You just have now essentially motivated their desire to go out and apply it, which is a different motivation than the one represented here. But we can and should be thinking about this. In cognitive science, we talk about cognition, cognitive, affective, and conative. And the latter two, affective is sort of who you are as a person and as a learner. And I don't mean learning styles. People do differ as learners, but our problem with learning styles is we don't have any valid instruments effectively. And so that's a whole other editorial presentation I give at different times. And the conative is our intention to learn. Are we willing to invest ourselves? Are we believing that we can? And that is really important, and that's what this addressing the emotional side gives us the opportunity to talk about. And so I strongly, we ignore this too often, and we shouldn't. So we've got another poll here. So I'd love to find out, in your experience, and we have a slightly different version on the screen than we do in the poll because we combine two issues because for the simple reason that we have a limitation on the number of questions we can ask in the poll. So I'd love you to let me know, how many of you seen learning tasks where the task didn't seem related to the material? We're talking about this and then you do this and it's not left. Or the task is completely knowledge-based. There's no real, it's reciting knowledge back as opposed to applying it to solve problems. Or the task is abstract. It's not enough context, and so it just seems arbitrary and abstract. Or, the alternatives to the right answer are just wrong or silly. The answer is too obvious or it's just silly. And, every time I ask it, almost everybody has seen one of those where it's just, oh, well, I could have passed this without ever even learning anything. In fact, I've done that myself, and you may as well. Or there's just a problem with the question itself that, with the wrong answer is too obvious. Also, where there's only one feedback for every wrong answer. And you'll learn shortly why that's a bad design. So I'm seeing a lot of people reciting examples, more than half in every category and hitting ceiling in a number of those categories. We're seeing bad design of learning, and this just doesn't do us any good. It just doesn't do us any good. So we need to figure out ways to address this. And the question is, how do we design good practice? And that's what I want to talk about today. So I've sort of set the stage. I hope you're with me. I'm ready to dig into it. what do we need? What is it that we should be taking advantage of? Sorry, sometimes I get carried away with stock photos, so bear with me. The first thing is we absolutely need to have a very clear idea, a targeted notion of what it is they need to be doing. And that comes back to that backwards design, which is really a backwards analysis in design, is we need to figure out how do they need to be performing at the end of this, and how do we know what that would look like. And then we can go back and design that practice that is very closely aligned with that performance. But if we have vague notions of what we want them to be doing, we're going to have vague notions of what we should get them practicing doing.
And Clark, that from our perspective, at least here at Nextlearn, we work with a lot of different industries and everything, and very seldom are we the expert in the area to figure out what that bullseye really is, and we're having to work with SMEs or even executives in the companies who have a varying different opinions on what that final end state is, which really clouds the water sometimes.
And you're absolutely right, and we're going to drill into that. You just set the stage for the next several slides beautifully.
Well, thank you. That's why I'm here, man. I'm the color commentator. So, all right.
Indeed, you have to cut through that. You have to cut through that with a laser, because too often you get people coming and saying, I need a course on X. And you want to be nice, you want to meet the needs, and so you develop a course on X, and X may have nothing to do with it. Literally, people have come and said, we need sales training on, we want to teach people to do solution selling. And then, because they're not doing it, we need a course on solution selling, because we asked them to do it and they're not. And of course, it's not that they don't know, they're not rewarded for it. The incentives are totally for still doing the old style selling. So you need to make sure that, and that's part of the analysis phase, is what is it? What's the root cause? And I really liked what human performance technology, if you look at the International Society for Performance Improvement, sort of a smaller partner to like ASTD, they talk about human performance technology, and what I really like about it is their analysis stops and says, what is the performance problem? What's the gap? And what's the cause of that? If it's not a skill gap, we don't need courses. If it's a knowledge gap, we need job aid. And if it's a motivation gap, we need new incentives. And if it's an attitude problem, we need a different approach. Courses when you have a skill gap. And so you absolutely have to make sure that that's the need, that's the problem, that's the issue, and then you've got to go forward. And then you have to say, what is that skill look like? So thank you for that. And exactly, you do got to go to the experts. You've got to go to your subject matter experts. And yet there are problems with that. They are the people, they can add, they're the ones who are going to know. And indeed, you don't want to necessarily listen to stakeholders, but because you need to understand that, talk to the people who really do this. But there's a problem with this, and it has to do with this phenomenon. Subject matter experts can't actually tell you what they do. Let me repeat that. Subject matter experts can't actually tell you what they do. 70% of what they do is completely unavailable. And the reason
it's because they've done something. It's because they've done something 19,000 times, and they're an expert because they don't make any mistakes because they've developed an intuitive understanding, right?
No.
Okay.
Yes, but it's nuances on that, really. The way our brain works, as we acquire the expertise you're talking about by doing it those 10,000 times, they have compiled it away. It is below conscious awareness. And so consciously, what they have access to is what they learned. They still remember all the stuff they learned, so they tend to go, oh, well, they need to know this and they need to know that. And the good little instructional designer says, oh, okay, I'll make sure they know this and they know that. And it's not going to lead to any change. So you have to find a way to frame it, a way to talk differently about it, and to drill in. And in some cases, it means you have to work a little harder. You just can't take it. And they may fight you on this. And yet you have to work, and the key I suggest, I will get to, a key that I think is a way to think about this, but they literally can't tell you. And the other thing is, they do make mistakes. Experts still make mistakes. The average airline pilot, and you're going to be scared to hear this at first, makes about 2 errors an hour. And they've been trained incredibly. but the systems are robust enough to support that. So there's duplication in many systems, and they tend to have two pilots and things. So by and large, airline errors, don't lead to any bad consequences. They're just having a hearing on the San Francisco Airport Asiana flight right now, and they're finding indeed it was an error that they didn't catch. But so experts do make mistakes, but they tend to self-monitor and check and go back, and that's actually a really interesting part of a good example is doing that. But we're talking about practice today. So they can't, but they do have one thing they can tell you, and they can tell you why this is their passion. They can tell you why this is their passion, and that's really valuable as well. And we'll drill into that as well. But because why did they spend those 10,000 practice items? Why did they spend the hours to do this? Something about it makes it interesting enough to them that they will invest that extra effort, and we will use that to our advantage. So I want to suggest that what's at core, as I've already discussed, are decisions. And I actually think that this is the key we need, the key we have, is to go back to those subject matter experts and don't say, don't tell me what they need to know. Tell me what they need to be able to do that they can't do now. What decisions do they need to be able to make that they're not making right now? What are the decisions you make in doing this? And by using that language, and I'll tell you where it came from. I'm a big fan of deeply immersive experiences like you can deliver with Nextdoor, but games and such. And one of the game designers, a guy named Sid Meier, who designed Civilization and Pirates and a number of the best games, and all the the way he talks about games, other game designers really appreciate. And he said something that really resonated with me. He said, a good game is a series of interesting decisions. And that's really intriguing. And my twist on it, because at that time I was trying to find a mental way to get just to the heart of what a learning game is, I realized that a learning game is a series of important decisions. And I find that language works with subject matter experts to get them to reframe what they're giving you, to get them to focus on what are the things they need to do. And this gives you the hook to create not only a good learning experience, but a hook to make it engaging. And I have a claim that a good learning game is hard fun. It can and should be hard fun, and that's what I'll be talking about much more depth of the game side of it and the implications for this practice when we.
Hey, Clark.
Those of us are together.
Hey, Clark.
Anyway, yep.
Hey, we got a question that came up. Michael Massa posted a question, and this kind of goes back to when we were talking about the SMEs before you get into the decision making here. He says, you're better off talking to recent learners that know the struggles of learning. Clark's comment is on the problem of tacit knowledge. So if the idea of approaching the learners who have recognized the struggle, recent learners who understand the struggles of learning fresh, what's your take on that?
I think that can be a really useful source of information. I love triangulation, looking at multiple sources of information to give you insight. If the learners have struggled with the learning and then have finally been able to start succeeding, and learning goes, when I talk about a compilation, it goes through this accretion, restructuring, and tuning process. And accretion is you get the mental stuff about it, and you start practicing, and restructuring has to do with refining your understanding, and then tuning is just making it automatic. And so if they're beyond the accretion stage and into the restructuring and haven't yet still have a conscious understanding of doing it, they may well be a good site. There's the one caveat is that sometimes the way experts do things aren't the way that new learners are finding it useful to do it. And the question is, and I think it's still an open question, is whether you're better off going through the indirect path, through the conscious explication before you get to the expertise, or trying to go straight to the expertise. But I absolutely would say that's definitely another great source of that. Sometimes it's easier to have access to experts that's just baked into our processes, but if you can find those learners, I'd at least look at that, if not find that more useful. So thank you, Michael. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I reminds me of my former life as a Marine, and we would bring, as we're doing curriculum development and go back and reviewing courses, is we would bring in new learners to kind of act as to balance out those people who have been, those SMEs who've been doing it for so long, and that fits right in with what Michael's talking about. So
yeah,
excellent
and
stuff.
formative evaluation, you should be, when you create learning, don't think you get it right the first time. You should take it out there, test it, ensure, and measure, and if it's working, pilot it and refine it until you think it's working, and then you release it, until you have evidence it's working, I should say.
Yeah, course curriculum review.
Yep. Now, what you need as well are settings. If you just put those decisions in the abstract, learners don't perform as well in the probabilistic game. So one of the things you want to get from your subject matter experts are all the different settings these decisions occur in. So if you're doing something like negotiation, it can occur with a vendor, it can occur with your boss for a raise, it can occur at the store when you're shopping for home stuff, it can occur with your kids, it's not supposed to. So you really want to find the different settings, because when you're trying to create a powerful experience, you're going to find that sometimes settings that are more generally resonant than perhaps the exact performance environment. If you know the performance environment, fine, but the more the skill is at a higher level, like communication in general, the better off you're practicing in different settings, or finding a setting that lets you abstract it better and recontextualize in different places. So the recommendation is find settings, stage settings, in which this action will occur that are going to resonate with the learner. And getting settings from your subject matter experts where this stuff applies gives you a greater variety to find one that will work as a engaging experience. And I strongly believe it, and that's affecting that emotional side of the equation. Now, one of the things about our cognitive architecture is that we don't make random errors by and large. There is some randomness in our architecture, and which is why it's not a good idea to try and have us do things by rote. If it's rote, automate it, or use performance support. It's that complex problem solving and pattern matching and model application and meaning making that we do well. But we're not going to do it perfectly. And one of the things that happens is when we're doing it, you'll typically see patterned errors among learners. And these happen because we bring in misconceptions. We operate by models. Our brains bring in models to help us solve things. We will create them if we're not given them, which is why it's really important to give them in the learning experience. And then show how that model guides performance in this context, and then gives you the chance to practice applying those models in that context. And when you do that, understanding the ways they reliably go wrong, because the models they're bringing in, they tend to bring in certain particular models that seem appropriate and just aren't. Those are really powerful when designing learning experience, because those are the alternatives to the right answer. Instead of silly wrong answers, instead of obvious wrong answers, actually make nuanced ones. That if they don't really understand this, if they're still carrying around this misconception, you can detect it and address it, which is, as I mentioned earlier, having just one response for all the wrong answers. Why that's such a bad idea is that you should be having the alternatives to the right answer. All your wrong answers should be reflecting different ways of going wrong, and you want to address each of those differently. And so you need the opportunity, and don't immediately give it when they make it, except perhaps in a single choice, multiple choice. Let the world provide that information and let it play out before an external. That was the wrong decision. It's like God speaking. Let the story play out and then provide that feedback. But you want to capture those misconceptions and give them the opportunity to make those errors in the practice environment before they have the chance to do it in the performance environment. So I really want to suggest understand where people are making mistakes, and then give them the chance to make those mistakes and address them rather than hope they don't happen, because that's not a particularly safe bet, right? So, you guys with me so far?
I think so. What's so the idea of, you've got, when you're creating choices, you've got the best choice. I like to sometimes create it or put the circumstances together where the best choice isn't even available for some reason. If you write the story right, the most obvious choice and the correct one isn't necessarily available, but so you have to choose between two lesser ideal scenarios, and hopefully, we intend to we write it so that the scenarios themselves are taken from common, and going back to the idea of the setting. You're in a setting and the scenario is developed in such a realistic manner that this is an example that would happen in the real world. What about the idea of just taking the right choice totally out? Do you think what's your opinion on the repercussions of that?
Well, my first reaction is, if the learner is in a no-win situation, that's very frustrating. I can't do what I know is the right thing. Now, if this occasionally happens in the real world and you want them to be able to deal with that, then it makes sense to make that occur at some frequency. We were doing a simulation on administering analgesics, painkillers. What happens is there's a complication. The prototypical painkiller in this case is morphine, and it has a side effect of respiratory complications. So this is particularly a problem for asthmatic patients who start with some respiratory problems. So the natural occurrence rate of asthma is about 15%. We ramped it up to 50% in the simulation, just so that it didn't happen very often. When it happened, it was really important, so we gave them that frequency. Similarly, if there are situations where they aren't able to apply the right answer and they need to go to plan B, you might give them a frequency of seeing that. But just on base, I don't know, I always get frustrated when I see a situation and none of the options I would want to apply are available. Like, somebody's gaming me here.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's important that you create the context in the storyline itself that explains it, so that they're not placed in that frustrating position. Like you said,
or in the feedback afterwards, and thank you for leading in the next topic. In the feedback afterwards, you could have a character somehow explain why ordinarily you'd be able to do X, but in this situation you only had the choice of Y or Z. So,
okay.
Yeah. I really hate introducing frustration, except if dealing with frustrations when your educational objective.
All right.
But feedback is important, and to get back to a point I made a little earlier, I really hate it when an external voice comes in right after I've made a choice. It breaks the flow, and when you're creating a learning experience and people have invested themselves into a setting and put their mental state into that setting, and they've acted in that world, I really want the world to react before an external, out-of-this-world influence comes in. And I can't claim that I have deep research on this. I'd love to run the study, but in general, you'll see that play out in experiences you are eager to have in games that there's not that external feedback. It is what is communicated through the experience in the world that the game is set in. And it turns out, well, there is Michael Allen once said something that I always believe, don't immediately provide feedback, because if you need to be sensitized to looking for the information in the world that tells you how you're doing, you should make that information available in the learning experience and let them learn to detect what the feedback is instead of providing it externally, and then when they go out in the real world and there's no external voice suddenly going, that was a bad decision, that doesn't extend their learning. And so
yeah, that applies equally to the idea of recognizing when the choice should be made too. A lot of times the problem I see in developing sims is we immediately represent, as soon as we throw out the choice, we're flipping the switch in their mind of the decision-making process, and a lot of times we need to set it up so that they would, and this is a tough thing in developing simulations based on the technology that we use, is creating something that allows them to interject when they would make the decision, as opposed to being told, now it's time to make the decision.
Yep.
And that plays. I see that happening on the other side of things.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The more that you have to detect, make sure at least the final practice begins to really closely approximate the way things play out in the world, and you have to detect that it's time to suddenly take a conciliatory tone, for instance.
Yeah.
One of the tools in your repertoire now to try and increase the likelihood of successful transfer, our goals in learning are retention over time till it's needed, transfer to all appropriate, no inappropriate situations, and that confidence, is exaggeration. And here's the reason why. In the real world, you're going to be motivated. When you're performing, your compensation may be at risk, your job may be at risk if you don't succeed. So you're motivated. Now, for the learning experience, you tend not to be as motivated. Can we ramp that up? Instead of, for instance, working on a patient, could you be working on the ambassador's daughter? Could you be making the sale that saves the company, not just the next sale? You will be motivated in the real world, and the closer you make the motivation and the learning experience match the real motivation in the world, the greater likelihood that it will successfully transfer. And so this is what, why is this person putting makeup? She's in the theater, and they exaggerate things for entertainment and to communicate messages, and that's the story we're looking at here. And one of the neat things about the technology environment, is in technology-delivered learning, we have records. The digital equipment can record what people did, and then people can go back and examine their tracks and say it provides a topic for reflection and even for discussion. Hey, you chose to do this here. What were you thinking? And together in a group discussion, this can be a real interesting source for unpacking different ways of looking at the world and, again, addressing misconceptions and different ways of thinking about things. And so it's really powerful to have digitally delivered learning experiences. There are powers to, face-to-face role-playing. You put yourself in the person's experience, you can get a bit more visceral, but having that record is a really powerful outcome as well. And to reiterate a point that I made before, you're going to have to tune the experience. The odds are that you get it perfectly as best as it can be the first time are small. The properties of people are not like the properties of concrete. They're not as predictable. And our designs, and so you should expect that you're going to have to, particularly when you're trying to get the subjective experience, if people are engaged, that motivational, emotional component, you're going to have to take a first stab, and then you're going to have to do some evidence. Ideally, you should have an outcome metrics that you're shooting for. You should be saying, hey, I expect people after this experience to perform at this rate. I expect them to make this level of errors, and I expect them to rate this experience as this way subjectively. And then you should develop it and test and see if you're at that. And if not, you should invest. And too often we just develop it and release it and say we've built it, it is good, and that's just not the case. Even Atul Gawande wrote a lovely book, The Checklist Manifesto. And what he did, he was concerned about survival rates in developing world. And there were people who knew the right things to do in medical, and yet they weren't doing them for a variety of reasons. And he was concerned about this, so he created these checklists. And he turned survivability rates from about 20% to about 80%. This is just a phenomenal impact, just with simple checklists. But it wasn't the first edition of the checklist. He built them, he tested them, he refined them again and again until he felt they were actually hitting all the things they needed to do and didn't have any extraneous stuff they didn't. And that's the effort. Now, if you're running out of resources before you're hitting your metrics, you may evaluate your metrics and decide maybe I can lower them or not. But do it consciously, not, too often when you say, when do you stop iterating? Oh, when we run out of time or money. Wrong answer, okay? So this is where we are at. So please do, tune it and test it. So there's a road ahead of getting there. I don't expect you to be able to tomorrow to be able to suddenly create perfect practice. But now I hope that through this presentation you've gotten some good ideas of the types of things you could and should be doing, and I'd like you to start working towards that and testing it and refining it. But this is the elements. These are the elements that really increase the likelihood of your practice leading to a difference, leading to making an impact on the organization, on the abilities of the organization to achieve the goals the organization is trying to achieve. And I should have mentioned back at the target, if you should be looking to have that practice impact some key business metric. The problem with Kirkpatrick is people start at level 1 and go up to level 2, and it starts dropping off from there. You're supposed to start with level 4. What is the business thing that's not occurring? What is the business metric that we think that a skill gap is keeping us from achieving the levels we'd like to achieve? And then you say, okay, let's design, figure out what different things would people do to impact that metric, and then let's train them to do that and see that they can do that. And if you align your learning that way and then add these elements in, so when you have figured out what can be in the world and what has to be in the head, and then you start developing this practice to address what's in the head, giving them a series of activities that develop their ability, a series of practice environments, you have a much higher likelihood of impacting the business in a progressive way and justifying your contribution to the organization.
Hey, Clark,
Yep.
that kind of brings to mind that I'm kind of interested in your opinion on the idea that sometimes there's companies, they say, hey, we want to develop immersive technology-based training. We've been doing it the face-to-face. In fact, we have an intricate and very successful process that evaluates people. They record them, and then they send out the recordings to different groups and different executives, and they evaluate it, and then they come back and they provide feedback. And a lot of the training itself might be, say, public speaking type skills, nonverbal communication, that kind of stuff. But yet the company is saying, hey, I want you to convert this successful program into an e-learning thing. And from people like you and me, it's our job to do that. But on the other hand, we face the challenge of saying, you know what, what's working for you right now, the way you're having your people practice, there's a success to it. It costs an X amount of dollars, and you think you're going to save money by bringing in technology here. What if it's not always the right answer? How do we as designers and developers kind of tackle that challenge?
Well, I think the real thing is you have to start getting creative with technology. So let me just take that example, and then I'm going to jump up to the higher level principle, if you don't mind.
Okay. No, please do.
In those cases, they are practicing, right? They take turns getting up and presenting to the class, and then they get feedback on it. So they're performing and getting feedback, and it's that action or reflection cycle that leads to learning. And for instruction, we design the practice and we guide the reflection, and that's what increases the likelihood. So actually, I can think of a way to take that online in that we present them some principles of good speaking. We have them show them examples of good speaking. In fact, I developed led the design of developing a course on speaking to the media. But then the third step is they need to perform. Now, how do you deal with that in a asynchronous technology-enabled world? Well, one of the things they could do is they can film themselves. And they could just look at it themselves afterwards and have a rubric to ask. How did you do this and that? And then they could self-evaluate, tick the box, or move a level. I was pretty good at this part of it, of not moving my hands around too much, but I didn't use my voice enough. I didn't pause enough. So you could have this self-evaluation. Now that's more powerful than nothing, and it's certainly more powerful than just telling the principles of speaking on an online course. They actually have to speak, and this is a way that they can individually evaluate. It would be far better if they circulated it to others who were taking the same course, and they evaluated each other, and it would be even better if they then either they had, or in addition they had, an expert reviewer who looked at the performance and gave them feedback. So there are ways to do this, and in the media skills course we had people speak into we took a programmable answering machine, and what they did was they drilled down to this particular problem under the guise of calling into this news agency and speaking to radio or speaking to television news, and eventually they got asked some questions and they had to answer them, and then we played their answers back with them along with a model answer. So there are creative ways, but there are creative ways to use the technology to address that. But the old approach of take a PowerPoint and add a quiz isn't it? And so you really have to find ways to get them to perform. And there are ways that technology can do that. But there are benefits to doing it live in front of people instead of just a camera, because there's more of the real-world stress. that you would face
Absolutely.
in doing it. So, what you have to, so going back to the original question, what you have to do there is manage expectations. Understand, we will do this, and if you don't have the capability of capturing video and replaying it and having a self-evaluation rubric at the same time and building that, you can't do it. But also, even if you could do that, you have to set expectations. This is better than nothing. And the initial investment, whether it amortizes across enough people to end up being a money-saving thing, which is what they're hoping to do, you can't assume.
Yep. Got another question
for you. Document and demonstrate that, and they have to
got another question for you.
Trade-offs. Sorry.
Yep, we got another question for you from Elaine St. John. She says, ask if you can please go over again what you mean by in the head versus in the world. And I know that goes back to one of your initial diagrams there when you were talking about as we develop and that kind of that shift in paradigm. But if you could review again the difference between where we start in the head versus in the world.
Yeah, and thank you, Elaine, for helping point out when I'm not clear, and I forget sometimes the things that I may think versus what are real. So it gets back to a sort of philosophical position about we've now documented in work by people like Ed Hutchins that a lot of our knowledge is in the world. Most people, you ask them, I give you a 1-800 call me, and people don't know what numbers that maps to. They don't store in their head all the letters that are associated with the phone numbers. They look to the information in the world. They're printed right there on the darn keypad, right? And so you just look it up and realize C is C is 2 and A is 2, et cetera, et cetera. You look that up in the world. So that's what I mean by putting information in the world. And it can be in a job aid. So if if you have products or services that have complex features, like you have a complex router that has this number of Ethernet ports and supports this different number of protocols, or if you have a financial package that has this free checking and that free savings, and the credit card only costs this, and it's more than our brains can hold. So if you put that information in the world, people can just look it up. Otherwise, then there's what's in the head, which can be knowledge or it can be skills, the ability to do. And so it turns out to be hard to get stuff in our head, to get us performing certain things reliably, repeatably in context. To get us to remember rote information is really hard. We do make some random errors even when we've done that, and it's really hard. Our brains take specifics and turn it into gist. You don't remember the exact words in a novel. Typically, you remember what the overall story was. And so, and similarly with skills. So, we can develop skills with deep practice, but we need a lot of space practice to really get in head. So as much as possible, I'm arguing that it's cost-effective to try and get the stuff to get people to perform right to be guides to get them access the right information and little wizards to help them make the right decisions, and do the training when it absolutely has to be right. When it's proprietary information that you can't trust anybody to provide for you from outside, and yet it's business critical. But if it's just standard business skills, just for the, buy it. Don't build it. But I'm now getting away from now on an editorial soapbox, so let me rein back in. But I hope, Elaine, that helped, that the notion of put lots of, if it's just facts, if it's information, make it accessible that people can find it and search it. The average knowledge worker spends 30% of their time looking for information and is successful only 50% of the time. This is a tremendous waste of information. Making information findable and searchable is a better.
So we as designers, that's why we can, if we're creating that just-in-time learning and we're using our mobile devices as they're available and creating content that is accessible on our mobile devices, that allows us to access that in-the-world knowledge, which can then augment our in-the-head knowledge. Is that kind of a good summary?
Yeah, awesome. If it's work you're doing at your desktop, have it available through the desktop. That's why that backwards design started with what was the performance in the world you wanted. What do you want people doing? If they're not at their desktop and yet you need them to be able to do X, yeah, mobile is a great solution.
All right. Well, I think we're kind of at the end of our time.
Yeah, I want to. So thank you all for your time. I hope you found it valuable. I want to mention the blog, learnthis.com. A lot of the thoughts that that emerge and show up in various places start there. So, but other than that, I really appreciate those of you who spent time with us today, and I hope it made sense, and I wish you all the best.
Yeah. Again, Clark, I want to thank you so much for being one of our NextLearn partners, and we really look forward to seeing you at the conference in Charleston. It's a beautiful city, and all of you who are participating will be receiving a discount code in the mail. And feel free to share that with your coworkers. Don't pass it around to too many people, but we definitely want you to help spread the word about the ILU conference. It's growing, it's getting bigger, better, and the more people, more professionals like you, people who are willing to take the time to get on our monthly webinar series and to learn and to share. It really is, it's what we do to create a community of practice. And on that note, just to let you know, I will be presenting at the conference as well, doing an actual case study and analyzing our monthly webinar series and how it has or has not, where it has succeeded and where it has fallen short, and helping to promote and contribute to the idea of a community of practice of e-learners. So please come out, see Clark, see me, and we would love to have you. So Clark, again, thanks to you. I appreciate it.
Thank you all.
All right. That's all I have for everyone. If you have any other questions, please send Clark an email. His email's right there. You can also contact me at any of our NextLearn people at support@nextlearn.com, and we'd be happy to take care of you. So everybody have a good day. Enjoy the rest of your week. Bye-bye.